Good morning, respected director, sir, staff, faculty at SIDTM and etprime.com, the distinguished dignitaries who are there today for this wonderful unicorn masterclass, SIDTM alumni across the globe attending this event, and all my dear students, a very warm good morning. Disruptive technologies are changing how businesses are conceived and developed the globe over. Ever increasing connectivity, cooperation, and collaboration propelled by transformative technology have blurred geographical boundaries and created a kind of global thought process. The previous approach of understanding the local business culture and DNA before entering the market is now kind of passe. Establishing an entirely new initiative, say in a new geography, therefore, I think is less daunting and more of an avenue and opportunity. So if I view my own students, the observation clearly is that today's generation not only have the vital skill sets, but are also very open to innovation and are ever willing to take risks. And this has paved way for startups. The startup ecosystem has lured thousands of talented individuals across the globe. And the best and the most welcoming part is that India today has joined the force with all aggression. So in 2020, if you look at it, India was among the top 50 innovative economies. It is currently the third largest startup ecosystem in the world and is a home to 21 unicorns valued at 73.2 billion US dollars. And more than 50 startups might join the unicorn club as early as 2022. So, according to market researcher CB Insights, despite the pandemic, the lockdown, and impending crisis looming large, India has seen a total of 7 new unicorns in 2020, and there's no stopping. So, young individuals like you aspire to be entrepreneurs more than any other age group, but are unlikely to act on their intentions. So, according to this global entrepreneurship monitor, the gap between intention and action averages 6.1% for 18 to 24-year-olds versus just 1.6% for 25 to 34-year-olds, with close to around, say, 50% of people aged between 17 to 30 now attending a higher education institution. So which was compared to say 12% in 1979. So universities are a fertile ground today for starting up as they have an exceptional access to what is essentially a captive audience. Therefore, I certainly believe that universities can play a bigger role in facilitating students with potential platforms for business ideas and the right motivation to turn their aspirations into reality. Not only would this enable more students to kind of pursue their entrepreneurial dreams, but it would also strengthen universities' reputation and contribution to the regional economic development, productivity, growth, and innovation. With this thought in mind and the bigger objective to encourage the startup culture through the institute, to instill the entrepreneurship spirit, to reduce dependency, to foster self-reliance, and to make the most of digital technology, we launched the virtual entrepreneurship series, Demystify Disruption, Unplug, Unsettle, Unfold on April 17, 2021, in association with ET Prime, the premium digital content platform from the House of the Economic Times. The series also has a significance as SIDTM will have completed 25 years of its prolific existence in June 2021. So today we'll see the unfolding of the second edition of the virtual series in association with ET Prime with FinTech as the core theme. So ladies and gentlemen and my dear students, it's a moment of great pride for me as we unveil the first ever Unicorn Masterclass, exploring the theme, cultivating a culture for billion-dollar clubs within campuses, steered by the best key panel one can ever think of. And needless to say, it's an absolute honor and delight for me to welcome our impressive key panel. Let me begin by welcoming our first panelist. Having gained extensive experience as a portfolio manager with Morgan Stanley, he co-founded India's first free-to-use web-based direct mutual fund investment platform in 2016, one of India's youngest and first completely free direct plan investing platform, Kuvera. On behalf of Symbiosis Institute of Digital and Telecom Management and ET Prime, I welcome Mr. Gaurav Rastogi, CEO, Kuvera. Hi, Gaurav. Welcome to the panel.
Thanks, Tripti. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, ladies and gentlemen, an industry veteran with over 2 decades of experience. He has held several influential and senior management positions across market financial service organizations. He has served as the CEO of Edelweiss Asset Management and Enam Asset Management Limited. He has a broad range of interests across functions like sales, distribution, marketing, investment banking, product, and customer service. He's also fortunately our esteemed moderator for this prolific masterclass. On behalf of Symbiosis Institute of Digital and Telecom Management at ET Prime, I welcome Mr. Vikas M. Sachdeva, CEO, MK Investment Managers Limited.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to the panel. Moving on. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my proud privilege to introduce to you the man behind India's most admired startup. From being a school student who was tired of the conventional methods of education to starting a business at the age of 14 and eventually founding India's biggest stock brokerage company in 2010 with a disruptive pricing model and an in-house technology. He is the man behind this fintech company headquartered in Bengaluru with a presence across 9 cities. A startup that recently made headlines as the stock brokerage company that gave itself a 1 billion valuation without having ever gone out to raise money from investors. And now, the Hurun Global Unicorn list of 2020 values the startup at a whopping 3 billion. A rare profitable fintech startup that bootstrapped itself to billions and achieved a unicorn status in 2021 despite all odds. On behalf of Symbiosis Institute of Digital and Telecom Management and ET Prime, it's indeed an honor to welcome Mr. Nikhil Kamath, co-founder and CIO, Zerodha, and co-founder True Beacon. Welcome to the panel, Mr. Nikhil Kamath.
Thank you, Tripti. You're making us all sound like celebrities. It sounds different.
You are one for all the students and for all of us who are aspiring entrepreneurs. I think definitely all of you are nothing less than a celebrity. In fact, more than what a celebrity can be.
No. Thank you so much. Everything in the media is exaggerated. Take it with a pinch of salt. But thank you for the introduction, nevertheless.
Yeah. So we now begin with the most enterprising classroom ever. And at the end of the classroom, we'll also have a question and answer session by students of SIDTM. I now hand over the session to Mr. Vikas Sachdeva, the moderator of this session, to please take the Unicorn Masterclass ahead. Over to you, Vikas.
Thank you, Tripti ma'am, Abhijit sir, faculty of SIDTM, ET Prime, and all the students who tuned in. 30 years ago, as a management student, I had the opportunity to listen to a discussion on the business strategies of Dhirubhai Ambani and Ratan Tata, both iconoclasts of their generation, both daringly different. Dhirubhai had actually just set up the Patalganga refinery and had wowed the world with his world-class execution. Ratan Tata, on the other hand, had taken the unprecedented step of selling off a Tata company, Tomco, Tata Oil Mills Company Limited, to Hindustan Lever, used to be known as Hindustan Lever then, and had attracted a fair bit of flack from the group within. After all, actually, nobody had ever sold a Tata company before that. What I'm trying to say is that as a student, I was inspired by their differentiated thinking, the ability to take risks and set a path of their own. And not just me, it was very, very inspirational to a bunch of Indian students way back then. Today, 30 years later, I have the privilege of being on the same panel with two inspirational icons of this generation who have already shown us a glimpse into the fearless ambitions of a new digital India. I'm sure this discussion is going to be just as inspirational to the students in the audience, because let me tell you, I'm already in awe of what they've achieved so far. So without any further ado, I'd like to just start off the discussion just to set the ball rolling. Nikhil and Gaurav, can I ask you to spend a couple of minutes just sharing your thoughts on the topic for the discussion today before we start? Starting with you, Nikhil.
Hi, Vikas. Sorry, I missed the last part of what you were saying. Can you say that again?
Can I ask you to spend a couple of minutes sharing your thoughts on the topic for discussion today before we start?
Sure. And the topic is?
Topic is creating a culture of startups ecosystem within campuses today.
Yeah, sure. So, Vikas, I like that Praveen and Amy are on the side laughing and putting their face down when I'm saying something. I haven't had too much of an educational background, but one thing that I have learned from people I have spoken to who have done, well in the startup ecosystem is in many ways our system of pedagogy, our educational system has not evolved with the times to the extent that it should. Having on ground pragmatic experience is probably very important and will go a long way in defining people's careers. At work, I'll give you an example of what we do. When we hire people, we look less at their educational qualification today, but we pay more heed to their hobby projects and the skill sets that they might actually bring when they start working with us. So very important to have this entrepreneurial ecosystem inside the campus. And I'm sure Symbiosis is going in the right direction. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Gaurav, what about you? Any thoughts on the topic?
I think Nikhil makes a very good point, and I'll just add a few things. Um, Entrepreneurship should not be made into this larger goal. Young people are impressionable, right? If you tell them, "Hey, entrepreneurs are cool. Everyone wants to become an entrepreneur." You should want to become an entrepreneur. Maybe for you, the right time is 14, as it was for Nikhil. Maybe for someone else, the right time is 40. For Colonel Sanders, who started, Kentucky Fried Chicken, it was when he was 64 years old or something like that. I mean, that's a true story, right? So, while I like the fact that people are talking more about entrepreneurship, people are giving it a bigger platform, but I'm not so sure whether pushing people into entrepreneurship does it make better and more entrepreneurs. um, in our generation, and I'm probably one generation before Nikhil, so in our generation the pressure was always engineering and medical, and I don't, that was not healthy. And if you say that now entrepreneurship is something that people should do, um, the information should be available, the clubs should be there, people should self-identify, but they should self-identify for a reason or for a cause that is higher than entrepreneurship is.
Interesting that you mentioned generation. I think I just realized probably three different generations here. And I think with each passing generation that I have seen, I talked about Dhirubhai Ambani and Ratan Tata, and then you talked about your generation and now Nikhil's. I think the process of becoming entrepreneur has become a little bit more normalized. Earlier, it used to be a little bit, you get a job, work, settle down, and entrepreneurship was usually fraught with a lot of uncertainties because of the ecosystem, if you will. But I think we are now living in a day and an age where this is something which people look forward to, and people no longer want a job the way I look at it. People want to create jobs through entrepreneurship. So thank you for sharing your thoughts.
I'll just add one more thing, because if you don't mind, quickly, right? More than normalizing entrepreneurship, what we should try and do, which I don't think we still have it, we should try and normalize failure.
Very good.
And I don't think we still have that culture, whether it's within an organization or whether as an entrepreneur, right? I don't think we have this culture where someone can stand up and say, "Hey, you failed, but I'm pretty sure you learned a lot of great lessons, which can now be used to build something within a company, outside a company, doesn't matter, right? Whether you're starting it out." That culture we never had. We always had a culture of excellence and of lionizing winners, which is good. Every country does that. But one thing that Silicon Valley has moved on to do really well is to normalize failure. And I don't see that yet in our ecosystem.
That's a very good point you're making. Normalizing failure. Excellent. So, Gaurav, I just wanted to actually ask you, and diving straight into the discussion right now, what was the thought process behind setting up of Kuvera? I mean, we've just heard that you have a lot of pioneering, initiatives to your credit in terms of being the first direct platform offering mutual funds and all of that. But what was the thought process when you quit your job, a brilliant job at Morgan Stanley, and started Kuvera?
See, I'm a kind of a late entrepreneur in an Indian ecosystem setting, right? In India, if you're 25, then hey man, you've missed the boat, uh, which is not really true. But I did kind of, I grew up in a middle class family. After my education, I got a job in the US. I did the most obvious things, right? Got a job, went to the US, worked there for 4 years, then went to business school, then worked for another 6 years, New York, Hong Kong, and that life is also very good, by the way. Yeah, entrepreneurship provides you a certain kind of platform, provides you a means to actually make a meaningful change. Zero cost brokerage, that's an example. That's a meaningful change than where India was before. Free direct plans, I hope that's a meaningful change to where India was before, right? And that impact is much higher. But for me, the journey started because I was in finance, and it was quite obvious that finance for the longest time was built for the wealthy, and for good reasons. In a RM driven culture, a relationship manager driven culture, the relationship manager's time is the most valuable commodity.
Hmm.
So they will go after the highest value accounts because that's where the return on their time is the highest. Why would they spend 1 hour talking to me when they can spend 1 hour talking to someone who has 20x more wealth, right? um, Technology of course changes that. Technology kind of normalizes that, and it gives us all the opportunity to say that, hey, maybe that's not the best model to run finance. Maybe the best model to run finance is to just make everything open, make everything transparent, and then trust the end user to take right decisions. That's the other thing. In the old model, it's always, you always keep on telling the end user, you know nothing. My RM will guide you. Someone will teach. Maybe that's not true. Maybe that assumption we have made on finance is not really true. If you give people all the information in a transparent and easily comprehensible way, maybe they can take the right call for themselves. And that's a very powerful thought, right? So that's how Kuvera started, and that's how I thought, right, and the opportunity was there. I mean, to be honest, for me, it was more of a calculated risk, right? I mean, I was already 36 when I started Kuvera, so it was a very calculated risk. For me, it was like, okay, there is, SEBI had just come out with the direct plan ruling, and surprisingly, direct plan penetration was still very low in 2016 when we started. 3 years later, no one knew. So there was a gap, right? I mean, now of course everyone knows, and direct plans get more flows than regular plans. So that's how it happened. Yeah. It was not some, like, 19-year-old and ting, and then you started something.
No, I mean, just a bit of a trivia here. I was on the SEBI Mutual Fund Advisory Committee, which actually debated very hotly about the direct plan. In fact, the
Right.
original discussion was direct plan should be online, but in the minutes of the meeting, the word online got dropped. So there you are, direct plans. We have a fabulous industry thriving here. But you talked about being 19-year-old and ping, and I saw Nikhil smiling. So Nikhil, how was the idea of Zero Dark conceived? What prompted you to enter this space? Was
Mm.
it a ping? What was a ping?
Yeah, so back in the day, we were traders. So I have a brother who's the co-founder as well, and we would trade. Uh, Go back 12, 13 years, the ecosystem was very expensive. Brokers of the day would charge as much as 0.5% for a day trader. So the way trading works is 90% of the market is speculation, 10% is actually investing. When you look at the turnover numbers that the exchanges put out, what people often don't realize is 90% of that volume comes from derivatives alone. The thing with derivatives, if you have 1 lakh in your account, you can trade worth, 10 lakh, 20 lakh, whatever. And this brokerage that you're paying is not on the 1 lakh, but the 10 lakh or 20 lakh exposure that you take. So 0.5% might not sound like a lot, but is actually a lot. Back then, if we made a profit of X, we would pay brokerage of X into 2 or X into 3. And it was really bad and ridiculous as an ecosystem. The intention when we started Zero, it's been 11 years now, was, to create a platform which we will use ourselves, stop paying the fees that we were paying to Share Khan and ICICI and Reliance Money, which were the peer group and the biggest ones back in the day. After that, everything since then, we have no big educational background, we have no MBAs in house. Everything has been really organic. We started a platform, we started trading on it. A bunch of friends asked, can we use it since you have it already? So we thought we should charge them something. And we said, okay, let's charge them 20 rupees and say buy how much ever you want. Because as a broker online, order matching does not happen in India. A broker is only a hop between a client and the exchange. So say, for example, Vikas logs in and says buy Reliance. All the broker is doing is sending the order to the exchange, which then does the matching and sends it back. there is no incremental cost if you buy one share of Reliance or a million shares of Reliance. So we thought, why charge that? And our entire intention was never to be a large broker or a corporation which, makes a revenue out of broking. So we felt it was fair to do that. We started like that. Things organically grew. We got lucky very, very many times in life. We started in 2009, right after the financial crisis of 2008. So very little money going into the broking industry, or right now everybody who has a plan and something else gets crazy amount of money thrown in, right, from Ps and VCs across the world. Back then that wasn't the case. It was very uncool to be in fintech. We were in the right time, right place, first mover advantage, and things organically grew from there. The one good thing which we did, unlike other people, I think, is we always stayed very transparent. We shied away from becoming this corporation, but tried to become a community of traders for other traders. So we never did any advertising, we never put an ad. We didn't have a sales team. We don't have a sales team to date. Every account that we open, every product that we sell happens from an inbound query when somebody calls us and says they want to buy something. That allowed for us to not take in venture capital, which most often companies take to acquire client. Since we don't have a cost of acquisition, it did not make sense to take external capital. And in many ways, we have stayed, true to what we started with. We never increased the fee that we charged. In fact, we made it lower and made equity investing completely free a few years ago. But the company has scaled, luckily and organically, over the last decade, a little over 11 years now. And we have been able to ancillary grow into the other industries that we had some exposure in back in the day. We started an asset management company again about 2 years ago. It's called True Beacon. Here again, we're trying to eliminate all the middlemen. When you go to a private bank or a wealth manager, the distributor charges a lot when the ultra HNI ecosystem is in play. We're trying to eliminate all of that. We became an NBFC a few years ago. We do some lending against shares. We run a fintech incubator, a venture capital firm, which kind of encourages other companies which are doing cool stuff, building interesting product in our ecosystem. The most important and relevant thing in all of this, because I think, is even though it's in the news so much, and you hear about these stupid valuations in the media and all of that, one has to bear in mind that the financial market ecosystem in India is very tiny. We might be growing a lot in the last 1 or 2 years.
Sure.
Say out of the 130, 140 crore people in India, only about 5 crore people file for income taxes. Only a couple of crore people actually pay reasonable income tax. In that, the number of people who have either direct or indirect access to financial markets is probably only about 2%, 2% of the population of the country. That relative to the West, where that number might be 60, 70%. Uh, with real estate plateauing over the last decade, there have been no real returns on a very illiquid asset class like real estate in the last 10 or 15 years. The government does not want anybody to buy gold in India because we don't have any gold of our own. We import everything that we have. We've probably, in the last couple of years, imported something like $500 billion of gold to just service, the domestic jewelry industry. Big hit on our fiscal deficit. Government hates it. Interest rate cycle is on a decline. Now a bank FD does not even give you as much as inflation rates are prevalent in the country today. People do need a place to park capital. Everybody has savings, right? India has a high saving rate. So when you need to save money, you need to put that money somewhere. And equity markets will become more prominent. The liquid nature of them, I think, is the biggest added advantage. Then you have favorable taxation. You pay 10% if you hold something for 12 months. But why this is relevant to the kids and the students who are part of this group today is that 2% penetration uh, invariably will go up. It might go up to 5%, 10%, 15%, whatever in the next decade, but that will go up. So it's probably a good industry to weave a career for yourself when you're starting off today. It's very important to, enter an industry after college where you have some kind of tailwind, and you're not fighting against the tide. You're not in an industry which is slowing down. So I would definitely recommend each and every one of you guys, to consider fintech, consider things around the stock market. There will be plenty of opportunities today, but it will consistently go up at least for the foreseeable future.
That's impressive. I think the takeaway for the students and for me, when I'm hearing both of you, is what are the reasons why you should become an entrepreneur, or one of the reasons which can be a raison d'être for an entrepreneur is a latent need of the customer. Okay, which the customer may or may not know about it right now, but you have spotted it, and an intense amount of customer centricity and feedback loop, which will make sure that this translates. I think that's very very incisive. Thank you so much. Moving on to my next question, you talked about, Nikhil, you talked about creating this whole company. A company is probably feeding of its culture. There's a certain organization culture and I think it's very symbiotic, if you will. A company feeds off its culture, a culture gets created because of the company. But my question to you is, you talked about very limited real world experience, when we started off this discussion, and you started off very, very young. So starting off very young with very conventional, limited real world experience, how did you manage to create this hungry, successful organizational culture, which is extremely customer centric?
Sure. So I'll give more credit to Nitin, like my brother. We have split roles in the company. I do all the stuff around markets, risk, and investment, and he handles people and marketing and stuff like that. He has this knack of, getting large teams to get behind a vision and really driving not the short-term future, but the long-term perspective of a company, and it has worked out very well for us. But I'll give you an example. Like when we started off, like we started under the brand name of Zerodha 11 years ago. Before that, me and him used to run a wealth management company called Kamath Associates. I'm talking 13,
Sorry,
14.
called what? I just
Kamath
missed the name. Sorry.
Associates. Our names have Kamath in them, right? So yeah, and a small team, tiny office on Banarghatta Road in office, Banarghatta Road in Bangalore, about 7, 8 of us. We picked people, like the first employees we had is my neighbor who I used to play cricket with in the apartment I grew up. His name is Venu. He was one. Somebody I used to, who made me have my first drink in life. His name is Karthik. He was another. We put like 5, 6 of them together, and after like 12, 13 years, this is the management team we have today, and these are the people leading different divisions. Right now we're fairly big. We're about 1,500 people in Bangalore, but these are the leaders of the time, who kind of like have grown with the company. And these were all people who were friends first, and then they became colleagues and now leaders in the organization. So the first 500 people we hired, we have this, uh, I don't know how we have managed this, but I don't think more than 10, 15 of them have quit after all these years. They're still around. And we have a very flat system of hierarchy. I think that really works in the organization. If I'm doing something stupid, or if another leader is doing something stupid, we have the room and the gumption in a way for people to come and critique us, even if it is us at fault. And that has continued up until the day. We don't have people with inflated egos, and all of that, I think, is a part of creating culture. Normally, traditionally what you see, especially in India, is if you are somebody's boss, you treat that person like your slave in some way, and everything is done according to your whim, and his opinion generally does not matter. Here we have tried to turn that around and said everybody's the same. We'll give you a base salary which is XYZ, but you earn the real income that you do either through employee stock options or through incentive, which you gain from projects you initiate and all the great work that you do.
Fabulous. Gaurav, I'd like to ask you a question, and it's a 360 or a 180-degree different question I want to ask you. You've actually come in from the real world, a very, very structured ecosystem. How did you adapt to, in fact, set up a culture which was more attuned to the virtual or fintech world?
Um, See the difference between, I think, a large firm and a small firm. Large firm, um, smaller firm are more mission driven. And one of your biggest kind of, one of the big things that you want to inculcate is that sense of mission in every single person, and that sense of accountability. And that sense of accountability, like Nikhil mentioned, could be around them being able to question you, them being able to propose new solutions. Some of it comes from necessity. You don't have enough people, so you want everyone to be able to do everything. You can't have a programmer who says, "Hey, I won't reply to customers." Right? How else will you know what the customers are thinking about the code you've written, right? So some of it comes from necessity. Some of it is also kind of planned in that way. Right? But as companies become larger, right? Like say, especially around I would say a size around 5,000, 10,000, right? Then org structure becomes very important because it's very hard to kind of then continue having a bit more of a, I would say, normalized or democratic, right? So, and as companies become older, the same thing happens. Then what happens articulation of what your culture is, articulation of what your values is a way that you can kind of promote the same behaviors at different levels, right? So I mean, I joined Morgan Stanley, 6,000 users, right? I mean, if everyone starts going to James Gorman's office and say, I have an idea, he's probably listening to ideas all day long, right? So some of these things have to change. And mission also kind of becomes less of a factor. And there's a reason for that, right? Because you're joining a large public company, everyone knows what their mission is. And their mission is usually, how to say it nicely, the mission is usually not let's make the world a better place. The mission is usually world domination. Larger a company gets, more and more the mission becomes market share of wallet. We want to be the largest, we want to be the biggest, right? Different mentality, different end goal. I mean, I use this example internally also, right? I mean, Google started with don't do evil. They became large enough, they dropped it. Does not mean that they are actively saying be evil, but now they're actively saying, hey, you know what? My shareholders want us to beat earnings quarter after quarter by 50, 60%. So be good, do good, but first and foremost, make tons and tons of money, right? So then your articulation of those values and articulation of that culture becomes different. How do you manifest that culture? You manifest that culture by giving your employees certain amount of freedoms. So I don't find that these two are kind of opposed to each other. A young company has to start with a mission-led approach, because if everyone doesn't get behind that mission, does not personally believe in that mission, um, it becomes harder and harder for them to do their best. But eventually, right, eventually when you become a really large company, if you go public and then you have tons and tons of scrutiny, you have an investor scrutiny happening, you have a CFO who has to report numbers to outsiders every quarter. It creates, that pressure creates its own responses within the organization, right? Um, and then it's, if you can be privately held, then of course those responses are lower. But I mean, you look at privately held companies, that have been there for, in the ag space, you have tons and tons of those examples, Cargill, Monsanto, right? They're privately owned and multi-generations, but eventually they kind of start mimicking a publicly owned large corporation.
That's very interesting. So, for the students, I think one of the things which I'm hearing, which may be useful for you, both Nikhil and Gaurav are saying that whatever is your core competency, you may or may not have a core competency before you join, but what is necessary for you is to be adaptable, to be flexible, to take on what you want to have to do, be multitasking, because in a startup, everybody has to contribute to the mothership. Sooner than later, you find a core competency, you start specializing there. But in the initial stages, it doesn't matter whether he's a friend whom you play cricket with, or he's somebody whom you hired as a programmer who needs to do multitasking. Everybody has to contribute to the mothership. Very interesting. In fact, that actually wants me to think and share with you that one of the maxims of our organization at a group level is your success is our success. It is not just the customers, but employees, vendors. We make sure that everybody is successful so that eventually it comes back to the mothership. Nikhil, I have my next question for you. And the last few questions, then we'll move to the Master of Ceremonies Apurva to ask the student questions. The discount broking space has evolved a lot in recent times. Is the space getting too crowded? And what could be the potential differentiators going ahead for somebody, for example, in the student fraternity who wants to start a discount broking vehicle tomorrow? You say it's too crowded, I don't want to be there, or there are some differentiators he can see and start moving ahead.
Sure. So, because technology is the definite differentiator in terms of the ecosystem you provide a client, all the tools one has access to. We have a great guy, our CTO Kailash, who has literally, like, built everything that we have done technology wise. I don't think it is getting too crowded because, like I said, like I mentioned earlier, only 2 of the countries still has access, right? So as the ecosystem grows, there will be potential for more people to come in, build new cool stuff. What one has to realize is like we are all a victim of our own success. By virtue of having done well over the last decade and having gotten a little bit of scale today, uh, we will organically and very naturally become a little bit complacent and not be the most competitive player out there.
Interesting.
The onus is on us as people who have been around for so long to find other people who have that gumption and the drive to replace us before we get to the point where we become too complacent. But there are definitely going to be options, new people out there, a new kid sitting somewhere who thinks of something that we have not done and does it better. Often companies fail to do this. When you become less relevant, or if for some reason somebody does better, you need to have the ability to take it with humility and either evolve or appreciate what the new person is doing. At the end of the day, because very little innovation happens in India, it's a weird thing to say. A lot of what all of us are doing in the startup ecosystem are copies of what happened in the West many years ago. We are better versions and better copies, and we copy it better than other people did, right? Like, you take any industry, you take asset management, you take broking, you take lending, you take anything in fintech. We don't talk about it because it makes us kind of diminish our own achievements to a certain extent. Now, tomorrow, somebody else comes and copies better, somebody is ahead of the curve, definitely can happen. Everything here lags the West by 5 to 6 years. And we've gotten into this weird phase in the startup ecosystem where everything is valuation, valuation, valuation. And, I'm not the best person to be saying this. I'm also an investor in some of these companies which are highly valued, but it is stupidity. A company losing 2,000 crores of money in a year if it is getting valued at $5 billion, or a company which does not have a business plan is valued at $2 billion, or for that matter, even us, the valuations we get are stupid. I mean, I don't think a company should, like us, making the profit that we do, should be valued at what the market says we are. It's an ecosystem where money is available, plenty of it is available. The Western economies have been very ruthless and non-frugal in the way they have gone about printing money. I'll give you an example. So in America, so think of money, think of currency as like a store of wealth, right? Like back in the day, it had a gold standard. For every dollar that you took to the central bank in America, you got a certain amount of gold for it. Uh, as it progressed, we had the Bretton Woods system as well, where every other currency across the world was pegged to the dollar in one way or another. Come 1970s, Richard Nixon is the president of America. They're fighting two battles on two sides. One, they want to send someone to space faster than Russia, and they're fighting a war in Vietnam. They said, we will no longer adhere to the gold standard. We will say the dollar is valued X. It will be defined by supply and demand in the ecosystem, but we will no longer show you that a certain amount of gold sits in our Federal Reserve. I think that's when the logic of money, I think that tiny thing that he did then, he said it's a temporary thing to, circumvent what was happening in the near future. But that one action, in effect, has cued the concept of money across the world. America was probably printing about $500 billion in the 90s, was printing $1 trillion a year in the 2000s. Last year, they printed something like $5 trillion. One has to assume that when so much fresh currency is coming into the market, just because so much more supply, the values of the currency has to depreciate. But it does not depreciate. Dollar is artificially inflated because of, China supplies goods to America, does not take it back to their country, make it renminbi, they keep it in USD, buy debt, because they don't want their own currency to appreciate, because then China will become less relevant. So, for many reasons, let me not even get into the details. I feel the price of dollar is artificially inflated to a significant value. If I were to, have to wager an actual value of where the dollar should sit today, I would say it's 30-40% cheaper than where it is trading at in the open markets. So by that definition, I also feel when they send $1 billion to an Indian startup today, when they've borrowed it at next to nothing, the value, the actual intrinsic value of that money which is coming into India is a lot lesser. So even though the value of a company here might seem like it's bigger in a certain currency's perspective, I feel like there is a lot to be said about what the actual value of that money is and how this company should be valued. I think hyperinflation and inflation is already around. We are seeing it in certain commodities across the globe today, but that is not truly reflected in the consumer price index, because the price of cars and things we buy have not gone up yet. But it's only a matter of time before that happens. So whenever I hear about these ridiculous valuations we are getting, you should take it with a pinch of salt and see where that money is originating and why that money is flowing into India in the manner that it is today. So yeah, I mean, I think there will be turmoil across the world in many asset classes. Everything seems frothy today, right? Like equity at 40 times multiple is higher than we have seen it in any time in our noticeable history. We've a fair average of where stock markets should trade would be, I would be optimistic in saying 20 to 25 is where they should trade, 20 to 25 times forward earnings. So equities are frothy. I feel like cryptocurrencies, in some cases are ridiculously frothy. Real estate is inflated. So many asset classes, we have seen so much inflation. And I believe they're so frothy now that, a really, really large correction might not be uncalled for and might be the need of the hour. But I have many like biased opinions of each of these topics and asset classes. Let me not dwell into the details, but yeah, that's the larger perspective.
This useful information was very useful. Thank you for sharing. In fact, you actually preempted my next question, which I was going to ask Gaurav. Uh, Gaurav, my question to you, leading from where this is coming, he talked about crypto. Nikhil talked about crypto. So, what is the future of cryptocurrencies in the Indian context? And as an investment platform, how do you look at the asset class? And the second part to this question would be: do you see any business models on the horizon which use blockchain or crypto as a platform, which you think which could be something the students need to watch out for?
I'll give you the non-sexy opinions here. Okay.
Please, please, all yours.
uh, so first question is, what is the future of crypto in India? The future of crypto everywhere is what the central bank decides. This whole idea that this is decentralized finance, this is deep, they're all very cool sounding terms, I must say that. But at the end of the day, a central bank can decide whether your INRs can be converted into Bitcoin and back. If that's not allowed, there is no Bitcoin. So, I mean, I can speculate what I think is right and how it is a social good and how decentralized finance. But honestly speaking, right, there are central banks that have banned crypto. Turkey as recently as about 3 weeks ago. Their central banks were saying, no, crypto is fine. It's okay as a medium of exchange as long as you can't take it outside the geographical borders. So if you have to sell it back into the same bank that you bought it from, same account, right? So so the future of crypto is literally kind of central banking. Now coming to blockchain, right? Blockchain, again, my views are slightly, sometimes I feel like blockchain is one use case away from becoming like this amazing technology. But that's been true for like, I don't know, 12 years now or 14 years now. It's always, back in 2010 is when I first heard about crypto, right? And conceptually, it's really, really cool. I did my undergrad in computer science, how a blockchain works, and kind of some of the characteristics a blockchain has. It's really intellectually very stimulating. And you will see that a lot of nerds get attracted to crypto, and this is the same reason I got attracted to crypto, because it's a proof. Simply put, you cannot change something that has already happened, right? And that allows you to theoretically build a lot of fantastic features. A ledger is the first thing. Ledgers are used in finance, so everyone thought that, hey, you know what, this is going to take away the entire ledger system right now, which is fairly archaic. But then people realized that every transaction on that blockchain is supremely expensive. Blockchains themselves private blockchains are cheaper, but then they don't serve any purpose. Then they don't have that public a proof of concept or proof of that event happening that you actually wanted to have. So is the technology still cool? Yes. Is the concept behind Bitcoin still cool? Yes. But for it to survive in the real world, at the end of the day, Bitcoin has to decide whether it wants to become a currency or it wants to become an asset, right? Now, the case for currency is straightforward. Central banks have to accept it as a currency for it to become a currency. If I say it's a currency, who cares? It's only a currency if it can be changed for other goods. If you can go down the street and buy a liter of milk or an Amul chocolate bar or whatever it is and pay via crypto, then it's a currency. It's a medium of exchange. It has a use, right? Now, if you think of it as an asset class, the only asset class that it can become, the only value that a crypto asset class can have is that it can become a trust asset. Now, what's a trust asset, right? Nikhil was talking about gold. Gold is a trust asset, no economic value. I mean, you wear it for jewelry, but that's pretty much it. People keep it because everyone believes that when my time is hard, I can always be able to exchange my gold for real money and do something with it, right? It's a trust system which is independent of the currency ecosystem. Now, can Bitcoin become that trust equivalent? I mean, of course, there is. In fact, I mean, the way I look at it, that's the only case left for Bitcoin now. For it to become a currency, people have tried too hard for too long. Central banks are taking very odd calls. Some central banks are allowing it, but not specifically allowing it. So they're basically letting it continue till one day they decide half of the governors, half of the bank governors, half of the Fed, Bank of England governors, half of them are pro crypto, half of them are anti. It's very muddied right now. And mostly you can't buy anything with Bitcoin. There are very few things you can buy a Tesla, but not everyone's dying to buy a Tesla. It's a currency when you can buy food, and you can buy kind of stuff that you need on a daily basis. You can buy a T-shirt. So does it become a digital gold or a digital trust agency where people say that, okay, I have all this money, but all of this money is in government structures, is in structures which almost 90% of the time do perform, but when there are massive wars or when there are famines, these structures break down, these institutions break down. When these institutions break down, this is my alternate trust currency that I can still exchange for goods and services. I mean, that is the only case, for gold also.
Correct.
Nothing else works, your gold bar still has value, right? So, I mean, but does it happen? I mean, my guess is as good as anyone else's. That's what is driving its value right now. But I mean, at the end of the day, I personally believe what is driving its value is pure speculation.
Interesting. I think for the students, one of the learnings you could have is that, while we are talking to both our panelists, they have been very comfortable talking about a variety of discussion points over and above what their core competency is, which means that you should never stop learning. I think reading is an essential part. I've studied both Nikhil and Gaurav. They read quite a bit. More importantly, I think they both study people for a living. They absorb a lot of knowledge from the ecosystem. So for the students, I think this point is that you can never stop learning, because I think that is going to be your competitive edge. I'm sure that if I start asking Nikhil and Gaurav about the latest Netflix movies, they would be able to wax eloquent on that as well. So it's not just that you have to read books, it's just that you have to be aware of what's happening, and that is going to be a competitive edge for you going forward. I have tons of other questions, but I'm going to just close out with one question for both of you, and then I'm going to hand it over to the moderator because I think we are probably exceeding our time here. If I have to ask you, crystal ball gaze, and talk about three things that will disrupt, you know, Nikhil, you can talk about the asset management business, and Gaurav, you can talk about the wealth management business. Although, conventionally both of them could ideally be talked about as two sides of the same coin. But what are the three things that you think will potentially disrupt, the asset management business and the wealth management business, respectively, in the next few years? Nikhil, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, so we did many things, on the asset management side. We started off with a platform called Coin many years ago, where we sold direct mutual funds. We're becoming an AMC soon, where we will create low-cost ETFs and mutual fund products. On the ultra HNI side, like I was saying earlier, we started True Beacon, where we've eliminated the middlemen, but it caters to an audience where you need to have $2 million and above as the investing capital. The one thing I've realized here is the role of the middleman is going away. I think you need to own the product. You need to own the mutual fund, you need to own the ETF, you need to own the Cat3 AIF or whatever. Uh, but the role of the guy in between who's connecting the buyer to the product, uh, I think there will be considerable consolidation there. And when it gets to the point where there is 100% transparency in the ecosystem, that role will become smaller and smaller. I think it's very fee heavy right now. Like, even when you pick the best mutual fund, if you're paying 2% a year in management fees, that means you're paying half of your principal compounded in 20 years to the fund manager, irrelevant to the fact that if you make money or you don't make money. You could be losing money and paying half your principal. The interests are not aligned. I think fund managers should be paid according to how well they perform and not a statutory fees every year. I think that will change. We've been flirting with the idea of having
Um, the big differentiator, and if you start thinking along these lines, is that for a wealth management platform or for a platform that is in personal finance, owning that customer becomes the key constraint. Once you own the customer, you can own their wealth needs, their lending needs, their insurance needs, and so on and so forth. But owning here does not mean that you're giving them a lot of freebies and there's a lot of cash back happening. This is not about habit forming, right? This is about long-term trust, because money in financial services is made over the long term. Banks are a perfect example of this, right? They are in the business of building these relationships for 10 to 15 years. They probably don't do a really great job in India of doing that because they're so pushy and they kind of try and oversell what they have or missell what they have. But that's ideally the business that a bank goes in, right? I think personal finance platforms or wealth platforms have to satisfy that need. And whoever is able to do that, whosoever is able to do that in a good way, the top 3, 4, or 5, have a fantastic future, right? Now, where do I see the big threat coming to players like us, right? The big threat almost always, the truth in a lot of these industries which are heavily regulated. I'm not sure if Nikhil agrees with some of what I'm going to say or not. The biggest threat is always that some of the incumbents actually get their act together.
Actually get there?
Some of the incumbents actually get their act together.
Okay.
They have everything in place. And the HDFCs of the world, the ICICIs of the world, they have 10 million users, they have the customer base, they have CASA accounts, they have stickiness that we can never have. A CASA account is the stickiest wealth product.
Correct.
is the stickiest, right? It's not like credit cards where you have 4 credit cards per person. In the US and India probably it's 2. So the biggest threat almost always is that before this industry becomes big, the top 3 or 4 banks suddenly say, okay, you know what, we are going to change our stripes. Now, the counter to that is that it usually never happens. The incumbents, because of the way they are structured, because of the principal agent problem they have, the principal agent problem, simply put, is even if the bank wants to change, the senior manager in the bank is not willing to give up a substantial P&L because in the future they might be making money. Right. So that's that's the dichotomy. But I always say this: I think the biggest threat for a lot of us is that the incumbents wake up and realize that the world is changing um, way before some of us become large enough, right? I mean, in case of discount broking, we've seen that the incumbents changed, but not fast enough, right? I mean, they waited and they waited and they waited because you're charging 30 basis points, 25 basis points for a transaction, and there's zero that was charging zero. You are like the manager, even if at the senior most level you are kind of convinced that this is where the world is going, you can't let go of that 500,000 crores of revenue every year because that's going to reflect badly on you as a manager. But that's the biggest threat in my opinion.
Interesting point. When we talk to the large financial institutions and banks, and there is some of them have actually gone through leadership change in the last few years. There is a lot of nimble footedness, at least mentally, which one gauges. I completely get your point. Digital first, fintech first. I think that is what most large organizations have already started doing. In fact, when I hear both of you, and I'd just like to close with this comment and hand it over to Apurva. I was reading this book by Thomas Friedman. Thank you for being late. I don't know whether you've read that. It's turning out to be one of my favorite books. And I think one of the things which just hit the penny drop in my mind, he said that there are 3 things which are simultaneously affecting mankind, which has never affected us before, which is change, rate of change, and global warming. And he makes a very interesting point about the fact that earlier, the change used to happen at a rate to which mankind could adapt to. So when you had the industrial revolution and horse carriages gave way to autos, mankind was able to create rules for that and take that on board. But today the rate of change is happening at such an extent that mankind is unable to adapt. So by the time you're talking about rules for companies like Uber and Ola, you have driverless cars. By the time you think of an ecosystem for crypto, the world would have moved on. So what I hear from you is that you're very, very aware of the fact that disruption is probably happening in a more compressed manner than what it ever has happened in human history, and one has to be very well aware of what's happening. And I think that's a very useful lesson for all the students here. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to just ask Apurva to take over and ask the questions. Apurva, over to you.
Thank you so much, sir, and thank you to all the dignitaries present for that insightful session. We are sure that all the students present here must have drawn immense value from all the knowledge shared. Before we move further, we would like to make this event even more memorable, and we would like to request and call upon all the dignitaries present, the team of ET Prime and Director Sir, Deputy Director Sir, and Siddhi Dhoti Ma'am for a group photograph. Can we please have Praveen Sir and Vineet Sir also with the camera for the photograph?
I have to say, I'm really liking Praveen's new look with the beard and everything.
I think
There's always a rock star. Now he looks like one too.
He looks like he belongs in a rock band, not at ET. You're on mute. You're on mute.
So,
Ami is there. Vineet and I think Praveen.
Hey, thanks, Nikhil. And I think Zerodha is actually the rockstar company that you guys created. And Gaurav, Gaurav at least keeps meeting us when he is in Bombay. You also do, actually speaking, but you are in Bangalore. So, I just want to say 1 or 2 lines that, Nikhil, I know him for quite some time. Okay. And it's amazing how they have built that company. And what I always liked about Nikhil is that, he is always having great ideas. And, last time I met him, that was around 3 years ago, and that was a time we were discussing cryptocurrencies, and everyone was talking about it. And he was like, he had some very good ideas at that point in time also. Like, I remember we were sitting in that CCD at Kamla Mills. Okay. Yeah, and he was also planning to go to US for some vacation. And so that is cool. Like, he's there up there with all the new things that are happening, and they will try to incorporate it in Zerodha in some form or the other and give the best experience to the customers. And with Gaurav, like, it is more specific to about how does one look into what products and people buy funds. And third is basically Vikas. Like, I've known him for a very long time. Very neutral opinion. So I can go and talk to him about how active is going down. He will say, okay. I can say, like, whatever, like, he just listens and he maintains a cool mind. And trust me, it is not very easy to do that, especially in a polarized world that we live in right now. So I really give it to that. And I guess, like, that is getting reflected in the way he's managing his PMS firm out there. So I just wanted to say these things about all this panel, and it's been a great learning for me actually in the last 1 hour. Like, all three of you, like, we just got forwarded. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Praveen.
Thanks to you.
Thank you, everyone. And the photo session is done now. So now it's time for the Q&A round. Although we had an overwhelming number of queries for the event coming from the students, we have tried our best to address the most relevant ones. As Elon Musk once said, that if things are not failing in your startup, you're not innovating enough. We have similar question from Ms. Netra for Mr. Nikhil Kamath. Netra, can you please turn on your camera for the same?
Sure. Thank you so much, Aishi. Good morning, sir. The entire discussion was really intriguing. The question I have is, despite India's growing entrepreneurial spirit, over 90% of startups fail within the first 5 years, sir. So what do you think could be the reason for the same?
Well, firstly, it's a good thing that they fail, so some of us can at least survive and do well. I think it's a zero-sum game in many ways, but I think they're trying to achieve so much, right? Failure is a part of the process. I mean, if 10 people are trying to, be the market leader in a certain industry, not all 10 of them can. It's cyclical and it will change, and one person will have it for 10 years, someone else will have it for the next 10 years. So I would say it's part of the process, and failing in turn leads to so much. And even the startups which are succeeding are also failing. We fail on a daily basis on so many different aspects. Yeah.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure interacting with you, sir.
Thank you so much, Netra. Now, keeping in mind how technology and innovation have become two very frequently interchangeable terms in present times, we have another question from Prashant Shukla for Mr. Gaurav Rastogi. Prashant, can you please switch on your camera and ask your question to sir?
Thank you, Apurv. So, sir, it was a really great session. So, sir, I'll just tell my question. So, considering the historical information on entrepreneurship and innovation, how does our current economy, which is based on technology and knowledge, can support entrepreneurial activity?
So actually, it makes it easier, right? I think the problem is not that Indians were not entrepreneur, or that the older generation didn't believe in entrepreneurship. They were roadblocked in a lot of ways because of different constraints, right? There are resource constraints, but more importantly, the law of the land was not as supportive. So given today's world, like you said, like you rightly said, right? It's a knowledge-based economy. It's a fast-moving economy, and we have the demographic advantage of a lot of youngsters who understand the new technologies very, very well. It just aids in building that ecosystem faster, which is also one of the reasons why we have one of the highest startup rate in the world is in India, because the human spirit doesn't change. You need an opportunity and you need the regulations to let you do the things you want to do.
Thank you very much, sir. It was really nice to know the depth of it.
So thank you, Vishal. Moving ahead, we have yet another question from Sumuk, which is related to our theme of fintech, and it is directed to Mr. Vikas Sachdeva. Sumuk, can you please come forward and ask your question?
Yes. Am I audible and visible clearly?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yes.
sir, it was really a fascinating session. My question to you is, what is your take on fintech-related entrepreneurship ecosystem in India at present compared to a decade before?
That's a fairly easy answer. I don't think a decade ago this ecosystem was as thriving, as transparent, and as competitive as it is today. I've been part of the India FinTech Forum for the last 6 years. I can tell you about the last 6 years, and I've had an opportunity to see a lot of fintechs come in and make a pitch firsthand. I've been a jury member evaluating them, and I can tell you that things have just got better. The attention to detail, the execution capabilities, and what really fascinates me is the ability to spot customer issues, latent issues. See, everything else comes in later. And I think over a period of time, this entire fintech ecosystem realizes that yes, you need to do things very, very efficiently, and you need to do it at scale. But first, what is the customer problem? And that is actually, if you realize, has led to mass customization, if that is ever a word. Earlier, it used to be said that 20% of something will give you 80% of the profits, and the rest is not profitable enough. But because of the ability of these fintechs to spot and get into problem solving at a very micro level, we are now able to customize at a mass scale. And I think that has been fabulous. The other thing which is really exciting for me is that, while I was just talking about it before the session started, while a lot of people talk about the glamorous aspects of fintech in terms of what is interactive with the market and all of that, a lot is yet to be talked about in terms of how fintechs are changing the regulatory space, the regtech space, compliance, risk, legal. It's a fascinating world out there. And I can tell you that things are changing dramatically year on year, and it gets me very excited to see, how things are moving. I think in the next 10 years, at the rate at which we are moving, the top 10 in any field, you will start seeing very, very different names, whether it's wealth management, asset management, banks. You will see a host of different entities coming because of this thriving fintech space.
Yes, thank you, sir. That was really good. That answered my question.
Thank you so much, sir. So now we have a very interesting question from Varun Joka Samudra, and it is directed towards Mr. Nikhil Kamath. Varun, can you please turn on your camera and ask the question, please?
A very good morning, sir. My question is, after achieving the unicorn status, what should be the next focus for any startup? Should it be expanding into new verticals, or should it be enhancing the existing customer experience? Which one should be prioritized?
Well, like I was saying earlier, I don't think you should spend so much time on the unicorn status. See, the point of any company is, turning a profit. And I think in the world that we live in today, it should be turning a profit and being responsible to the community that you're servicing, and not just focused on turning a profit. Things like valuation, tomorrow, Varun, you might start a company. I might come put 10 rupees in your company and call you a unicorn as well. Don't pay too much attention to any of those metrics. Think about starting something which is socially responsible, which is not harming anyone, a good company which makes a profit. I think the cool companies of tomorrow, should be that. When you look at society, right, the narrative of what is cool constantly changes. Unfortunately for us, we have seen the last 20, 30 years where hoarding wealth and, having these words like unicorn associated has been considered cool. I think that is changing. I think, being more socially responsible, giving away wealth, all of that is becoming the new cool in the ecosystem. I hope that is inculcated at a very young age while you guys are in college. Like, your aspiration should not be to start a unicorn. Your aspiration should be, I will start a company that will allow for me to, be able to do all of these things in my community. I think that has to change.
Very good.
Yes, sir. Got it, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So next up we have Priyanka Chaudhary, and she has a question on one of the very important subjects, that is mentorship. And the question is directed towards Mr. Gaurav Rastogi. Priyanka, the stage is all yours.
Am I visible on?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, Ayushi. Firstly, I would say the whole discussion was very informative and insightful. So my question is, like, how important is mentorship, and how can the academicians help cultivate entrepreneurial mindset in the young students and guide them towards the billion-dollar journey?
Fantastic question, right? See, mentorship is always important. I look at mentorship slightly differently, right? So there are two parts to it, right? One is practical mentorship, where you are literally kind of, say, you are talking to someone who was in your shoes 8 years ago or 9 years ago. So that's literally like, they have lived the same life, they've lived the same journey. So that's like practical mentorship, where they can kind of advise you on the right career paths. They can advise you on avoiding the pitfalls mostly that they have gone through. You see, mostly what people learn in their lives are the mistakes that they should have avoided, right? So, and good decisions are what are left over, which were not mistakes in hindsight, right? So those were your eventual good decisions, because when you're taking a decision, you don't know whether it's good or bad. So, so mentorship is important because they can help you save a lot of time and effort in not going down alleys that they have probably explored and realized that that's not a good thing to do. But there's also a part of mentorship which I think that people. I mean, you can't exactly call it mentorship, but the world now has these amazing biographies that have been written about really famous personalities, and some of these biographies, right, they go into a lot of details on their lives, on their journeys, on the right decisions they made, on the wrong decisions they made, and it's a reflection of kind of the same thing. It helps you contextualize what decision you should be taking for whatever the problem you're facing, based on a much higher or a much richer data set than I spoke to 5 friends and my gut says do this. I mean, don't discount your gut. I mean, if your gut, there is some value in what your gut feels, but that larger data set on how different other people kind of reacted in a similar situation helps a lot. So seek out mentorships. In terms of the second part of the question, I don't think it's anyone's responsibility to inculcate an entrepreneurship, which is kind of, I mean, I'll go back to how I started, right? I think the purpose is not to kind of come out and say entrepreneurship is cool and everyone should do entrepreneurship. The purpose is to let people think about, is there a problem or is there a cause or is there an opportunity that you're so passionate about that you want to be the first person to solve it rather than someone else. Then become an entrepreneur. Don't become an entrepreneur because everyone who's cool is starting a company and so on. One of your colleague already asked this question. 90% of them will anyways fail. So have a more important reason than just 5 of my friends started, so I also started something.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for your insights. Thank you.
Can I add something about mentorship?
Sure.
Like, you guys are the right age, so I mean, I'll give you some my own experience of it. You often grow up in life thinking, this person is your mentor and you want to be like him and stuff like that. when you actually grow up and you become much older and you meet these people and you spend a certain amount of time with them, you quickly realize that everybody is a flawed individual. You start to see their weaknesses. You start to see that they are human in their own way. Just because somebody has done well in life does not make him superior in any way. Everybody is riddled with their own insecurities and their own flaws. So this concept of having a mentor only works till you actually meet the mentor. So when you have a mentor, try to have one you don't know and somebody you will probably never personally meet in your life, because otherwise that dream shatters very quickly.
Read more biographies, right?
Yeah, probably a better idea, especially if they're dead.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much, Priyanka, for that brilliant question. And thank you, the panelists, for answering all these questions so patiently. This really helped us in improving our knowledge in this area and getting a clear picture. So moving on, Ayushi, do you know when it comes to the number of unicorns, India stands third in the global country rankings, even ahead the UK and Germany. But there's a catch in this. Indian entrepreneurs have got more unicorns overseas than in India. This is a clear indication how important it is for us as a nation to cultivate the culture of such billion-dollar clubs within the academic campuses, which was stressed upon by our esteemed panel as well.
Absolutely. And not just that, according to ETBFSI, India's dynamic fintech industry has over 2,100 fintechs, of which 61% have been set up over the last 5 years alone. The total valuation of the industry is estimated to be $50 to $60 billion. And this industry's growth has been undeterred by the pandemic, as it has seen the emergence of new unicorns. I guess it would be safe to say that we are in for some explosive growth in this industry in the upcoming years. And well, this brings us to the end of a promising day of scintillating discussions. We will be back tomorrow with some more exciting thematic discussions on fintech and how is it providing a new dimension to finance. So stay tuned and we will see you tomorrow with a new group of panelists, but with the same enthusiasm. Thank you and have a good day.